here,
Okay.
some things that I wanted to ask you
Yeah,
about.
you go ahead, and then we can,
Of course, we can take this any direction,
I
anytime.
understand.
That's no problem.
Okay.
Well, I guess I might as well start with the, I know you were affiliated with the Rogers Corporation from
Right.
53 to 76, I believe,
Correct.
out there. I just wanted to know anything about how that might have come about, or...
Well, I'll start you off by showing you a picture I have of Buddy in 1960. This Buddy, that's my daughter, who was 19 years old at the time. And he was my crew cut. This is Henry Grossman. Have you heard that name?
I have heard that name.
He had a wholesale music company, and for the sake of having a percussion line of some kind, we purchased Rogers. I say we because I was working with him at the time.
Right.
And prior to that, I'm going back into the 30s. Grossman distributed Ludwig merchandise. At that time, Ludwig operated through distributors as well as direct to the dealer. And at that time, Ludwig was owned by C.G. Kahn. Now that name is almost out of existence today. I don't even know if they're still making instruments, but they were the top instrument manufacturer in the 30s.
Right.
Selmer was close. But Kahn was a recognized name all over the world.
Yeah, I had heard how they bought out the Ludwig company.
They were Ludwig and Levy.
And Levy, too.
Yeah, it's a strange situation when the Depression hit and everybody was hurting for money. Kahn bought Ludwig, and then they bought Levy. I don't know which one they bought first, but they moved them both to Chicago and put them in a building, in a corner building. They used one address for Ludwig, and around the corner there was another address for Levy. And then the drums came out branded as Levy Ludwig. And then Bill Ludwig Sr. got a little unhappy with the situation there and asked to be let out. And after he came out, in order to operate, he couldn't use the name Ludwig. There's where WFL came in.
Right.
His initials, of course. And in 1951 or 52, I'm not sure of the exact date, Kahn decided to dispose of the drum business. It wasn't profitable for him. So Mr. Grossman actually suggested to Bill Ludwig Jr. that he ought to buy the name back from Kahn, which he did.
Right.
And at that time, I kind of suggested that maybe we should have bought the name Levy, because that was a respected name for years. Excuse me. And but Slingerland picked up Levy. And I don't know if you know the history of that. They took Levy with the idea of making a second line out of it. And they did put up some material outfits under the Levy name, which were the same as Slingerland, except they changed the Lugs.
Right, I've seen a few of those at the Chicago store.
Right. Well, you'll see everything in the Chicago store. And in the interim, let's say, in order to have some drum equipment to sell, we were distributing Rogers, along with a few other distributors in the country. And I've told this story around, you may have heard it, that there was one remaining descendant of the Rogers drum family by the name of Cleveland Rogers. And the company went out under the name of Joseph Rogers Sons and Company Incorporated. That's about as British as you can get with the name. He became ill, was failing in health and wanted to dispose of the factory, which at that time was located in Farmingdale, New Jersey. So the supervisors of the Grossman organization got together and discussed the possibility of purchasing Rogers. Should we buy him? And we couldn't quite make up our mind whether we really wanted that or not, but Grossman was a chance taker. He liked to buy up little companies and develop them. So anyway, we bought Rogers, and our engineer, Joe Thompson, was living in Covington, Ohio. That's a little town about 30 miles north of Dayton. And he and Grossman went to Farmingdale, New Jersey to look over the plant. And it was in such bad need of repair that this was unbelievable. And Grossman came back and said, well, we have a lot of work to do to operate that factory. Anyway, he would go back and forth between Cleveland and Farmingdale, New Jersey. And once he took possession of the factory, all the inspectors in the area dropped in on him, told him his electrical system was bad, needed replacing, the plumbing was bad, needed replacing, everything needed replacing, which he was aware of, but figured he'd have some time to do that. Then he turned around to the inspectors and said, how come you're all jumping on me all at one time at this time? You've been operating here? He said, well, we felt sorry for the old man. We left him alone. He said, but now that you're the owner, you've got to fix this up. Well, it didn't take them long to decide to get out of there. And they built a factory in Covington, Ohio, on Joe Thompson's property. And that's why the factory ended up in Covington, Ohio.
So that was a small town area?
Small town, 2,500 population, 30 miles north of Dayton. Joe, prior to that, had a music store and a repair shop. So he had a partner in the business, and he turned it over to the partner and went to work for Rogers, became the engineer. And I happened to get involved in that because of my experience in the retail field. I was in the retail music store for 13 years. If you work in the retail,
was this Grossman's also?
No, it was called Schubert Music House. And if you work in a retail store, you have to learn your products. Sure. You have to know about them. So I became somewhat familiar with drums. And when the Rogers was moved and started coming into the warehouse, we did all the shipping and warehousing in Cleveland. Came all shipped every other day from Covington, Ohio up to Cleveland, and we would stock it and package it, etc. And I started to critique some of the drums coming up. Wasn't too happy about them. And I told Mr. Grossman, they really don't quite make it. And he said, what's the problem? I said, well, there's a lot of things that could be better. That's how I got into the drum business. And he said, well, as long as you're that familiar with the drums, I'm going to call Joe Thompson and let you talk to him. So I talked to Joe, and he said to Joe, so you bring them down the next time, down to Covington, south of Cleveland, and that's how I ended up in the drum business. Greatest thing in the world for me. That was in '53.
Some of those things that I'm curious about too, that you weren't happy with, which I can see so far. But I'm not sure if we had it before that or not. But the bread and butter lugs, for instance.
Oh, well, we carried those along for a while.
That was there before you guys came along.
Right. Okay. They had, if you recall, there were two different designs of the bread and butter lugs, as they called them. I could never figure out why they called them bread and butter lugs. Someone told me, so it looks like a loaf of bread. And I can understand that. The first ones were very plain, just plain surface. And Joe figured he put a little rib in it, which would strengthen the lug, except unfortunately it didn't strengthen it in the proper place. We used to fold the ears in. And when you put a lot of tension on the lugs, the ears would just pull away from the rest of the lug. And we realized we had to make a change.
I've seen it on.
And we did. So we made the changes in the early 60s.
It was nice.
We struggled along. Close the door, Julie. She doesn't realize
Did
it's
you say that?
Well, that's okay.
Oh,
That's so we realized that was, of course, everything else was, if you're familiar with the Rogers merchandise or equipment, whatever you want to call it, prior to our taking it over, you can see that most of it was not slanted towards the professional field at all.
It's more of a break-in market.
We call it rather a second or third line. It's just the heads and drums. See, Rogers originally, which I overlooked telling you, started years ago in the British Isles someplace, I think probably Scotland, as a vellum manufacturer. You know what vellum means? I never knew.
No, I don't.
Skin. Calf skin.
Oh, okay.
And they would develop it, and they were primarily noted for their heads. Back in the late 20s, banjo was at the height of its popularity. The banjo 3-star head, the pure white head, was the finest thing on the market. Every professional used a Rogers 3-star head. And then from that they went into making drum kits. And that's how they sort of backed into the drum business. But they never tried to compete with the main manufacturers at all. And again, I'm repeating myself, when Rosen purchased Rogers, we had no intention of competing with the 4 big drum manufacturers. We just wanted to have a line of percussive merchandise to sell. And Joe Thompson, being the brain that it was, kept coming up with little things to improve. And some of the things didn't do as quick as we could have or wished to do. And the lugs were one thing. We kept waiting and waiting, trying to improve the old log, and finally we saw that it was useless. So Joe Thompson designed the log and took it to a casting operation in Cincinnati, Ohio. Had the cast lugs made. And prior to that, cast was frowned upon. Not being too sturdy, etc. But as the years came along, casting became much more, what should I say, acceptable. It was, they developed the engineering so it didn't fall apart. We used to call it pot metal years ago.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because in my digging around up there, I found a lug that I've never seen on a single drum before. So it looks like a prime example of what you might be talking about.
That's right. This we used to talk about as being pot metal.
Right.
But in the late 50s, I would say, in the early 60s, they developed the cast lug to a much higher degree.
Right.
This is exactly what it's about.
So do you know what kind of a lug this is by any chance?
That's been, might have been a lead. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I couldn't find any.
No, you wouldn't find markings on it. No. It has a little style to it. I would almost say it was leading.
Yeah, but I can see what you mean about that not being as good. You can see the cracks in it.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So, but yeah. So then they started using better metal, I guess, and a better way of doing it.
Well, they developed a process where there wasn't so much air. I think there's a lot of air in there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't solid enough.
Yeah, it seems like pewter or something.
Right, exactly. So then we went on to that. Now, when we first started out, we used to buy our shells from Jasper in in Indiana.
Oh,
I was wondering about that.
Yeah,
I
Jasper.
know.
They made a lot of the
Like wine.
wood products for Kimball piano.
Yeah, but that's what I mean.
And I don't know how they got into the shell business, but again, we found that out and purchased from them. But we always had difficulty getting delivery. Couldn't get enough delivery as we started to grow. To the old store, when you first start out, you buy very sparingly. Everything is fine. The minute you start to improve your sales and you need more, then your suppliers have to keep up with you or you're in trouble.
Can I just try move? I'm going to try holding this for just a second because I want to get it a little closer because
Okay.
I want to make sure I can hear you.
I enjoyed this. We all did.
There we are. Okay?
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
You were telling me about the drum shells originally coming from Jasper, Indiana.
Indiana. And we were very happy with the grade of merchandise that we're getting.
that's all right.
Product was great, but unfortunately, like I told you, we couldn't get enough supply. So we started looking around, and finally
I just wondered if
hit on the Keller, who at that time was an unknown as far as the drum business is
Now, where were
concerned.
they from?
They're up in New England states. I think in New Hampshire. Sometimes I forget. And we were able to get shells up to certain sizes they had never made. And when it came to making a large concert bass drum, we were out of luck. So believe it or not, we would buy a shell from
So
Strauss
I thought maybe you were
and
going to.
refinish it to our satisfaction and make a concert drum. We may have never sold a lot of large concert drums, but we did make one for the Cleveland Symphony that was a 12 by 40. Actually, we took a 16 or 18 by 40 and cut 6 inches off of it and made a 12 single head concert bass drum from the Cleveland Symphony. And it had a tone almost like a bass viol. It was beautiful. They hung it up on a rack so it would be free floating and a terrific sound.
So what is it?
And we made a few others, but then we got Keller to make the larger shells, and we started to make them,
Celery,
for ourselves. At that time, the biggest bass drum we had was a 14 by 22. Keller never had any forms to make a bigger one. We got them to make larger forms than that. When we first got together with Buddy was always using a 14 by 24, as was Louis Belson. And we convinced them that they should be satisfied with a 22. Buddy said, always use a 24. I said, yeah, but you're working with a sextet. You don't need a 24-inch bass drum. Why don't you let me set you up with a 22 and everything will be fine? And he went along with it. And then we made the 24s for Buddy. For Louis also. Louis, prior to coming with us, was with Gretsch. And they used a 14 by 24 shell with, I think, 10 lugs on it. And we couldn't see that, so we put more lugs on the 24-inch drum. As a result, we had to use 2 different angles plates for the spurs. What we used for a 20-inch bass drum would not fit on a 22 or 24. So we had to have a collet plate with a slightly different angle so we could use it for the spurs. As you know, when we came out with Swivomatic, we tried our best to get equipment that could be interchangeable. So the plates, we call them collet plates, that we use for the spurs, we also use for the cymbal holders and for the tom-tom holders, but with a different angle for the rod to fit into. So it was great because the raw material parts were the same for many items.
Just a little change here or there.
Right, which was which was smart to do because the manufacturing costs, particularly in the drum business, compared to a large industry like the automobiles, became so expensive because you didn't make thousands of them. You know, people used to say, well, how come you can buy a screw like this and like that in a hardware store or General Motors? I said, well, General Motors might order 250,000 screws where we might order 5,000. That was the difference. So we tried to make parts interchangeable as much as possible, and it worked out to our advantage.
Great stuff. So I was kind of curious about some of your Swivomatic stuff. Now, I know you were.
Yeah, I was in on the beginning of it.
From what I understand, you went around and asked a lot of drummers,
Right.
what do you guys think we need, or
Right. I was actually in artist relations, giving it a fancy title. And because of my experience in the retail store, I had a feel for that. Plus being an ex-semi-pro, I never really classed myself as a pro. I worked in clubs, I knew what the situation was.
as a drummer or a trumpet
No,
player?
a trumpet player. Trumpet player. Never was a drummer. I'm not a percussionist. In fact, whenever I would do a seminar on the product, I would let the audience know that I'm appearing here only as part of engineering. I am not a percussionist, and I cannot demonstrate for you, but I will tell you what our ideas are into the drum. And my main purpose here is to bridge a gap that we felt existed between the manufacturer and the performer. I felt in those days that so many of the drummers or percussionists, depending on which part you're looking at, had equipment without any idea of what went into it. And there were so many, and I hesitate when I use this because I'm not trying to be derogatory, but there were so many self-appointed specialists in the drum industry. And when I would sit down and discuss things with them, I'd say, well, why do you think it has to be that way? Well, because that's the way we think it ought to be. I said, well, there has to be a reason for it. If you want something done that way, why? I said, no, I'll tell you why we do what we do. And I'm getting into why we came up with Dynasonic. That's all part of the Swivomatic. I'll get back to that.
Sure.
But when Buddy first started with us, he was playing on a power tone snare drum. And in discussing the product, he asked me, Ben, is it possible to make a drum that will respond easily when you're playing triple pianissimo or triple forte? And I said, I really don't know, but I'll go back and we'll talk to the engineer and we'll see what we can come up with. I said, what's the problem? Buddy says, well, most drums respond fairly well when you play soft or mezzo forte. But when you lay into it, he says, they seem to fall apart. And I think you know what I'm talking about. I said, yes, let's see what we can do. So I sat down with Joe Thompson and I said, explained to him what Buddy had asked me. And he said, well, let's look into something. Let's see what it was. And we sat down, and Joe did most of it, but I was in the little corner of the picture. What makes a drum sound? How does the drum respond to the player? Now, no one had ever come up with that kind of a question. Give them a drum, and we'd either tighten it or tune it, whatever you want to call it, and that's it. I'm making light of it, but I'm sure some Billy Gladstone wasn't that class, you know. But I used to notice that so many drummers just take a drum key and go around it and hit it, and they were satisfied. We didn't feel that way. We felt that the drum It was a musical instrument, and it should have some kind of a sound. Not just a rhythm maker, but it ought to have some sound. And that's what we strive for. We change the approach to the snare beds. I always remember that snare beds always are rather deep. And some fellows said, well, they have to be, otherwise the snares won't make contact with the head. So what you're doing is pulling the snares into the head, obviously. Mm-hmm. So then my question used to be, well, what happens to the snare head when you do that? And they said, what do you mean? I said, you realize that when you're putting pressure on the snare head, before I tell you what happens to your batter head when you put an internal tone control into it? You deaden it, don't you? I says, yeah. I says, then when you pull the snares into the snare head, you're deadening that too. Is that what you want to do? So they'd say, well, what am I going to do? That's the way drums are made today. I said, well, we're going to see if we can change that. And we did. That's really the story behind the Dynasonics.
So now on the Dynasonics, was there no indentation on the snare bed? Because I haven't noticed them all that much.
You can't see
the details.
There's a way to do it without making it so pronounced. See, what happens, if I may, I'll just get a pencil, keep you straight. Yeah. Looking at the bottom of the snare head, this is actually not very straight, but that's your snare head, looking at the bottom. This is the bottom of the drum, that's your snare head.
Right.
Well, what we did when we came up with Dynasonic is, and one of the reasons for that is when plastic heads first came out, when you put them on the snare drum, there was always a wrinkled part of the head. So we used to say to the fellas that you're really not tuning the head properly, are you? So what would happen is that these tension screws that were on either side of the snare bed had to be tightened a little more than the rest of them. I said, then you don't have uniform tensioning, do you? And they'd say, no. I said, well, that's not right. If you want the head, let's go back to the batter head again. If you want to tune or tension a batter head properly, you do it very, very gradually and have it even. And what will happen is, as a youngster, we all did that. We used to throw pebbles into pools of water. And if you would drop a pebble into a pool of water, what would you see?
The sound, or the rings go out, just like sound rings.
The ripples, wouldn't you?
Right.
Well, the same thing happens to your snare head. I mean, your batter head. When you strike a head, basically, you can't see it, but that's what's happening. The vibrations go out to the edge of the shell. Well, if you've got one side tighter than the other side, they're not going to run that smooth like they do when you drop a pebble into a pool of water. Mm-hmm. If you do that to the batter head, wouldn't it be nice to do that to the snare head also? So what Joe Thompson came up with was looking at a head as a clock, and here's 9 o'clock, and here's 3 o'clock, and here's 8 o'clock, and here's 4 o'clock. We would start to taper the shell from here, and in such a gradual way that you couldn't see it, but it was there. And by the time you got down here on the Dynasonic, you had a snare bed that measures 4 thousandths deep, which is very little, but just enough so when the snare head would vibrate, it would come down and touch the snares.
I see.
Now that was a complete different approach in the manufacture of the drum.
Plus the fact that the snare was in a snare frame
Frame assembly always kept it in tension.
Right.
What used to, I shouldn't say bug me, because after all, it wasn't a matter of life and death, but I used to notice that when young drummers particularly would come in to an exhibit that we would have, and they'd say, can I try the drums? I said, sure. And the first thing they would do is tighten the snares before they even tried the drum. And I said, why do you do that? Well, snares have to be tight. Otherwise, they're not crisp. That was the feeling along with these fellas. And I'd say, no, you're confusing crispness with tightness. It's not the same. If you want a crisp sound, it doesn't have to be tight. But the thing has to respond quickly. And with Dynasonic, we had instant response because there was nothing hindering the motions of the heads. What happens when you strike a batter head, you set air in motion, which goes down to the snare head, and that starts to vibrate. And when that starts to vibrate, it kicks the air back to the batter head again. And the proof of that is what happens if you just take a stick and drop it onto the batter head. It'll kick it back if the drum is free. If the snare head is choked, it won't kick it back quite as much. And we used to check that we would get a much faster stick rebound off of Dynasonic than we did on any other conventional drum.
Oh, how did you test that, by the way?
A camera, black light thing.
Oh, like high speed or photography or something?
Yeah, we even had some high speed photography done. Oh, excuse me. Hi.
Sorry.
We can stop.
Okay,
We can
guys,
stop.
sit straight.
For response, we would check the action, also in the black light, and we would find that we would get more definition from the Dynasonic. I don't know if you've ever seen the catalog page that we had on Dynasonic. It breaks it down in steps as to what happens, and try to think that when you black light it, that when you strike and you try to catch motions of the head, you get almost like this in a conventional drum. And with the Dynasonic, it would be shorter waves.
So it would snap back to flat a lot faster than that.
Right, because nothing was holding it. And the snare head was always free to vibrate in conjunction with the batter head. And that's what we talk about matched heads. I remember years ago working in the retail store when percussionists, particularly symphony percussionists, would come in and they go through skin heads and they try to pick out matched heads, and they would feel with their fingers, some of them would come up with micrometers. But that's fine, and I could understand that. After I got into the drum business, and I run into the same fellas, I said, what happens to the snare head after you put it on and you tension it with a deep snare bed in the drum? And I couldn't get an answer. Obviously, once you put it on the drum, it's no longer a matched head, is it?
The stretching, I guess, would
Well,
change things.
if you have a deep snare bed, there's no way you're going to match. If you want to take a tenor drum or a tom-tom, say, you can match those heads perfectly because you have level surface on both top and bottom. So when you don't have a level surface on the bottom, you have to make adjustments to correct that. I think I have here. Let me see if I got the right. Here's what we're talking about. Pinpoint, definition, choke resound, faster stick rebound, full dynamic range on a Dynasonic properly adjusted. You can play right on the edge of the head and get a snare response. And because there wasn't any choking to the snare head, you got a musical sound out of it.
Let's see. Well, that's a nice looking catalog there. I'm going to set this over here.
That's all right.
So I don't know how good the videography will be on
Well,
all that stuff. Unless
we can move the table a little bit.
Yeah, I can, when we're done, I'll stop and do those again with the camera.
In order to have the snares work, comfortably, we felt there was a need for a change in the snare strainers that were out on the market. This strainer was built on a roller mechanism. Very simple. We used to put out parts catalogs, and unfortunately I don't have any. And I don't think I'm going to be able to show you what I want to talk about. But I don't have it. But you could throw that strainer off with just a flip of the little finger if you want.
Right, it's really easy.
Because it worked on a roller mechanism in a slot. And there was a little sleeve that just rolled along the slot.
Well, a lot of them are just metal on metal slots.
Right.
And you're saying there's a little wheel in there.
That's right, like a little bearing.
Right.
Now, we used the same strainer on the Dynasonic as we did on the Powertone, with one difference. That because there was no pull on here, the inside slot that I talked about had a little hook on the end. We made the hook more pronounced on the Dynasonic so it would lock in place, because what keeps the usual strainer from slipping is the pull of the snares on the strainer, which in the conventional drum you had. I call our Powertone a conventional type of drum, where the Dynasonic naturally was different. And when this is properly adjusted, and I have one here, I'll show you, this will float, which goes to prove that there is no choking. And what happens is when you strike the batter head, the air column comes down and hits the snare head. The snare head moves towards the snares. We say the snares just kiss the head. As a result, it was free to vibrate.
So there was no muffling of the bottom
Not
snare
at
head
all.
that way.
Not at all.
I'm almost surprised that you even had a taper off down in here, because it seems like with the snares laying in a...
No, you had to have a little bit.
You did.
4 thousandths. You ever work with feeler gauges?
Not very
Well,
well.
2 thousandths is like a piece of thin tissue paper. So you can figure out what 4 thousandths. You can't see it. The Powertone had a snare bed of 8 thousandths, which is much less than the average drum. And that was also built on the same principle. Now, when we went into metal shells, that was done by fabricators. It wasn't a metal form soldered together and then decide what to do with it. This whole drum was made by people who fashion metal. The grooves put in, the little slots, you can barely see it in the front, it was there. All of that was done for a purpose. Now,
Even on the outside of the drum though, like that?
yeah, let me show you, to explain something to it. Every time you bend metal properly, you strengthen it. You take an angle. Why do they angle? Well, when they build airplanes, they build them on angles. The angle clips. Because every time you bend metal, again, I'm repeating myself, you strengthen it. So many other products on the market, I don't like to mention names, it isn't necessary, that had plain shells. And the minute you tension, they go out around. Now, one company in particular, as you know, had a bead in the middle of the shell. You know what we're talking about. great, strengthened the shell, except we went one step further and decided that the tension on the shell was not here, but between the top of the lug and the top of the drum. So when you tension the drum, where was the strain? It was right in here with it.
Oh, so that's why you guys put your bead there, on the top and the bottom.
trench, right.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Because that's where the tension was. In addition to that, we not only flanged the metal once, we flanged it twice.
Yeah.
Which gave it added strength. And the biggest enemy of a drum is when it goes out of level. Once it goes out of level, it's never going to sound properly. And when you tension things that don't have a lot of resistance to what you're doing, you're going to throw it out around.
I imagine with wood drums, you really run into that a lot.
You got to be careful. Right, and they have, now what we used to do with the wood drums, had a big surface table that we worked on. And when we would make the snare beds on the wood shell,
I'm going up the way, Ben.
okay, dear.
I'll be a couple hours.
All right. We had-
Enjoy.
Okay, big surface table with a rotary tool. First thing we do is make sure that the drum is perfectly level, top and bottom. Then we put it on the...
Excuse me, but it was nice meeting you. If I don't see you when I come back, come again.
Thank you very much. And if you're ever down in Tucson, you come and see me.
Thank
too.
you.
I want to make sure you're still on the camera.
Okay. So, after we would make sure that the drum was perfectly level, and we would have a light shining inside of it, and make sure there was no light coming out at all. I don't know how many companies do that,
Oh, I've never heard of that.
but we had in a dark room, and then we had this big surface table again with a rotary tool on it, and we just run the shell over, and it would give us what we wanted here. The rotary tool, that was, stuff like that. So you'd start from nothing and come to 4,000. I'm exaggerating, right? But we really took that care into making the drums, and they were checked. Every snare frame assembly that came up for Dynasonic was checked against a bead of light. And when we put that on a shelf against that light, if there was any variation in the distance between the top of the snares and that light, we knew that it wasn't right, correct? We put a lot of care into making the drums, more so than most people realize. There was never, as I look back, I felt that we never really did a 100% job in educating enough people. I tried, but I couldn't get all over the world at one time. That was my job. And I used to get rather perturbed sometimes. I'd walk into a drum shop that was owned by a drummer, and I'd see drums laying around, no tension on them, no nothing. And I'd say, what if a guy comes in and wants to try a snare drum? They know how to tension them. I said, they don't know how to tension this one. He said, what do you mean? I said, do you mind trying something? Tension this drum for me. And I found, and this surprised me, I had fellows try to tension or tune, whatever you want to use, a snare drum with the snares on. And I'd say, we don't do it that way. And they'd say, what do you mean we don't do it that way? I said, approach it in this manner. A snare drum is nothing more than a tenor drum, smaller size. Think about it now. The first thing you want to do, or a tom-tom, whatever, is tension or tune the drum so there's a relationship between the hips. You want it to sound right. If they're not tuned in relation to each other, you're not going to get the proper sound. What's the proper sound? What you like. There's no set rule, unfortunately. What you like. But our approach was tension the battery at first. Get the feel that you like. Not every man wants the same feel on the battery. Once you get that, then go to the snare. And tension or tube in comparison to the battery. Once you get that done, now what are the snares on the drum for? One thing, to embellish the sound of the snare. Add a snare sound. Add a snare sound.
That's what the throw-off strainer is for, I guess.
Exactly. Once you get the drum properly adjusted to your liking, because it's a very personal thing. You know, you can hand a guitar to a fellow and say, tune it up. The first string is E. But you can't do that on a drum. I've heard guys try to tune drums and this and that, but you can't just say, go ahead and tune that snare drum and make sure that the battery is A. You know that isn't done, I know it. The only thing you actually tune, to me, in percussion is timpani. You can adjust, you don't tune it, you do it timpani. Anyway, once you get the drum tuned up, and I'm repeating myself, now you add the snare sound. And what you do is add it gradually. With one stick, keep turning until you, and when you get the sound you want, you'll hear it. And you'll find that on the Dynasonic, when you do that, it's not choke. You go beyond that. I've seen too many guys go beyond it. And unfortunately, there were a lot of fellows playing Dynasonic that didn't know how to adjust it. But again, as I said, we can't be all over at one time. And if all of it, I used to tell people, you have a problem, got a phone number, call me up. I'll tell you what to do over the phone. We used to do that with that timpani. It used to drive me crazy. A guy called up one day and said, hey, I saw from the timpani school here, they can't do them. I said, what do you mean they can't do them? I just can't get them to respond properly. I said, tell you what you do. Go to the school, get the timpani arranged so you can work on it while I'm on the phone. Call me Collet. And I'll call you back. And I'll tell you exactly how to do it. And I found so many of them that never read the manual. So I asked the guy, did you read the manual? This is painful. I said, oh, I've been playing timpani. I said, yeah, but you haven't been playing with these. These are completely different. I don't know if you're familiar with the Rogers timpani. It's a completely different instrument. And it wasn't made to satisfy the professionals. Don Canedy, who was our educational director and eventually became director of marketing, John Canedy. Let's all look at his picture. Yeah, this picture. I pulled him out of the percussion department in Indiana State University. Prior to that, he was in Southern Illinois in Carbondale. That's when I got to know him. And he transferred from there to Indiana State. And the first year was there when CBS bought Rogers. 1966. I called Don up and said, Don, I thought I'd come to work for Rogers. We had been friends for about 6 years. And he said, hey Ben, I just got here at Indiana. I said, I know, but we want to go into education, and I think you're the guy that could do it for us. And he resigned from Indiana State and came back from Rogers. And he helped Joe Thompson design timpani that reduced the problem of tuning. It's when you put the head on, we use the key tension rods, we did on everything, wherever possible. You would tighten them all the way down. They couldn't go any further. That's backwards approach. Get this? Mm-hmm. And then you try to, if you'd find one that was a little sharp, opposite each tension, you back it off. Mm-hmm. That's how you tuned it. And when the pedal was on the off position all the time, we had a lock on the pedals. I don't know if we had timpani in this head lug or not. I don't think so. And as I say, unfortunately, I threw away a lot of literature. Now I wish I had it.
Yeah, of course.
But it was a very simplified method, and the reason Don and Joe got together on that is because he said, we've got to give the schools timpani that they don't have to spend hours tuning. And they were very simple to tune.
Mm-hmm. As long as you read the directions, huh?
You're right, right. And you know what the nice thing about it? Each drum had a range of an octave. Now, I don't know if any timpani out today have that or not, but at that time, no other timpani on the market had that range.
You know what I've always been curious about too is the Swivomatic, the arms for like tom holders and stuff. Where in the heck did that idea come up with?
I'll tell you in a minute. Turn that thing up. I want to check. I have to go to the bathroom.
Wait a minute, what was that?
He made a trip out here with his family. Harry Canedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I had talked to him over the phone, and he said, "Ben, I'm coming out west with my family. I'd like to meet you." So when he was leaving, I think California, he called me and said he was coming in. And I said, "Where are you staying?" It had to be way on the other side of town. I said, "I'll meet you." He said, "No, you won't. I'll drive out." And we had a nice chat.
Yeah, boy, he sure seems like he knows an awful lot about
Yeah,
drums.
he does. He does. Let's see. His Swivomatic. I mean, when something, while I'm telling you, now here's Timpani, but that's not ours. That's Jenkins, Jenko. See, at this point in time, in 1962, we were still buying some products from other people. We used Camp Go stuff for a while.
And then you'd rework it for your own
Well,
needs.
no, we never tried to hide the fact what we did. That's another story, Mark. I'll go into that. But I'm trying to find the Swivomatic.
We have some in here too.
There's one here, but I think there's one in this one. Show you.
Well, when I can remember being a little kid seeing those for the first time and thinking, boy, that's a neat idea.
And what brought it on, because when I went out and saw the problems that drummers were having, I remember sitting in the club one time and I saw a fellow hit a crash cymbal and it went like this. So I asked him, after you up to him, I waited until they were through playing. I came over to the table and I said, "You have problems keeping your holders tight?" He said, "Oh, they slip." I said, "Well, you're happy with that?" He said, "Well, what am I going to do? That's all there is. You buy what's on the market." So again, after my trips, I'd go sit down with Joe and we would talk for hours. Joe was a night man. He didn't like to get up early in the morning. And he liked to do a lot of his work at night. For the simple reason that he had no interruptions, And Joe and I used to sit there sometimes till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and talk. Joe would be working and we'd be talking with Joe. Anyway, I come back to him and I said, "They seem to be having problems with the tom-tom holders not holding properly, the cymbal holders." So there's nothing new really about a ball and socket. That's been around for centuries.
And everybody's shoulder.
Huh? Right. So Joe came up with an idea that ball and socket would be fine if we could get it to hold. The camera people did tripods, ball and socket idea, but there wasn't a lot of tension on it or anything, so it held. But when you wanted something to really hold, you had to have enough resistance that wouldn't let go. So Joe came up with the idea of making the ball egg-shaped. Now this comes out. This threads off. this part. So this is a separate unit from the ring, and I don't think it shows it here anyways. It doesn't. You see, this
I
top,
know that the top unscrews.
Unscrews, right.
Yeah.
So we have a concave in there. If you put it round against round, nothing will ever hold it. It just won't hold, because we found that out in all kinds of holders. You have round against round, eventually it works itself loose. So by building this H shape and putting these little tension screws slightly above center, it pushed the ball down into a pocket. And again, it being a little egg shape, that difficulty.
Now, is that egg shape just slightly
Oh,
egg
just
shaped?
slightly,
Because
yeah.
when I would look at it, I'd say, oh, that's round, you know.
Yeah,
I never looked at it closely enough to think maybe that's egg shape.
With a little groove in here. And these set screws, if you had a straight up and down, would fit into the groove. But the minute you put the two set screws on it, push it against the wall and into a pocket. No way could you move it. And of course you have a 360-degree positioning.
Right.
So we did the same thing here. Now, we tried to be everything to everybody. We couldn't be. So we figured here we'd make it for a right-handed drummer. And if he was a lefty, he could turn it around. So we put 4 holes in there. The biggest mistake we ever made. People would call up and say, "Hey, you shorted me 2 screws." And I'd say, "No, we didn't." "Yes, you did. There's 4 holes in there. I only got 2 screws." I said, "But you couldn't even get into the other 2. I tell you the reason for that is you turn it around. You take these 2 screws and put it there. It wasn't necessary. We should have never put it in. You know, you don't always do everything right. Because all you had to do was take it to them.
And I thought you were pulling their leg or something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, these guys will say anything to get us out
Yeah. But, and again, we had 360-degree positioning. And these are the different...
I'll pull this up a little closer here.
These are the different angles, see, depending on what size bass drum you were using and where you wanted it to fit.
Yeah, and I really liked the idea of these
Collet noses, we called that a collet nose.
Collet nose. Yeah.
And it was hex, you see. So once the hex rod fit into those slots, and no way it was going to move.
Yeah, those would really hold really good. So, how did you know how the idea came about for those, by the way, or?
Well, yeah, because as I told you, when I came off of one of my trips,
I know these, but...
Yeah, well, this is all part of this. See, again, this idea went into this. Instead of having a straight rod here, we came out with an angle.
Yeah.
And on the tom-tom, we had a straight plate, not an angle one.
Right.
Again, basically the same plate, except we put it in the press and punched the angle in it. And when we first started, this was all steel, and all the parts were silver soldered together. I don't know if you're aware of this, but that was a very expensive operation, silver soldering. Eventually, we ended up making these cast, which was fine, but originally it was steel. What you see there is a steel plate. Then we came with top-down lights.
Right. Now that's an idea you don't
We were the first ones to come out with. Now, somebody had flared the little flare on their legs, but we found that this eliminated the tom-tom creeping away from you while it was being played on.
If you spread the legs out a little with the flare leg.
By doing this.
Were you the first company to do that, or?
You're right.
Oh, no, everybody does it, huh?
First, yeah, nothing. We had a lot of things copied naturally. And if you notice, we carried this same idea onto the stands.
Right. Did that also help keep them from sliding away?
Right.
And was that tested and everything too?
It helped from sliding, but it was also a, what's the word I want to use? A look-alike.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I got together with Buddy, he didn't like this cymbal holder. See it? Came out at an angle a little bit.
Do you like them more straight up and down or something?
So what did we do? We took again, I'll talk about interchanging. We took the knobby units from the floor tom-tom and put them on a bass drum and made a cymbal holder out of it. See it?
With a bent arm or
Right.
L-shaped arm?
An L-shaped arm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the same unit.
Right. So I take it at that time he was one of your endorsees then?
Right.
62?
And here was this was the one after. Buddy was in this one. No, here it is. This is when we still had the bread and butter lugs. Now here's just Swivomatic.
And you know, I just love some of these finishes, which is another thing that I wanted to ask you about too. Did you folks make any of your finishes there, or were they all just sent off?
No drum company makes their own pearl.
I didn't think so.
No. Actually, we bought the pearl from, isn't that awful? I can't think of it right now.
Well, if it comes to you, you'll...
Yeah, it's in Connecticut. And their primary product were eyeglasses.
Right.
Now, how do you make pearl? Actually, it's two transparent sheets. They make a sandwich out of all this. They fuse it together. Did you ever know that?
Well, I've always wondered about it, and I've kind of experimented a little bit.
Yeah.
The pearl, for instance, looks like there's whatever color you want underneath.
It's a sandwich.
Yeah, and then on top of that, there's like a sort of a pearlescent, but at the same time, it looks like they take something. I've heard that they roll over it with cellophane or something like that, crumbled up cellophane, or something like
do
that.
Anything, sparkle. Where's the silver sparkle there?
Well, for sparkles, they would add glitter.
Right.
But for the pearl stuff, they put out spray a coat of something on it and roll over it with something, so that the color would show through in
Exactly. It's transparent sheets.
Right.
I said the simple explanation to me is it's a sandwich. Is what it is.
It's exactly what it is. And they give it a coat of clear after it or whatever.
And then we used to have problems with it bubbling occasionally. When you put the pearl on the shell, as much as you try, no shell is like a piece of glass. It's wood. We used to have strapping approaches. We would have some real heavy webbing with a wood block on either side and tighten with a big C-clamp. And every once in a while, the pearl would bubble. The end result was finally put on under heat in a roller. And what would happen is that you put enough glue on the shell, and as you ran it through a roller, it would squeeze out all the excess glue. And if there was a little crevice, it would fill it in.
Well, that's another question I have for you is about the shell construction. I know that some of the shells, it looks like the stuff is put on the wood flat first and then they roll it up into the shell. And then there's other cases where it looks like they got a shell and then they cover it with something.
Well,
Did you guys do that a certain way?
what we did, we got Jasper and Collet to provide us with a shell 5-ply, staggered seams. I don't know if you've ever been into that. Cross-laminated. Now, with all due respect to Ludwig and Swivomatic, what they used to do is have maybe 5-ply shell, and they would skive the edges, see, and they would take and put it together. And if you ever take one of the drums apart, you can see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So none of their shells were actually round. They can't be when they're made like this. Impossible, because at this point, when you got one layer laying over another, it can't be perfectly round. So what we did, or Keller did, or the Jasper did, they put them in a mold, and they had them butted, and they butted at a different place. So wherever you had a seam, you had 4 layers of solid material. Picture me?
Instead of just one thing where it all comes together.
Right, where it all comes together, because that would got to be the weakest part that you ever wanted to see.
Right.
So one seam was here, another one was here, another one was here, another, and then,
Well, I've seen drums like that at that place, the Chicago store,
Yeah.
where you can see that it's come apart, and some guy would take, they'd even take metal and, strips and
yeah, oh yeah,
put it all together again.
right.
But I can see how the way you guys constructed your drums, that would be pretty much unnecessary.
It was as round as it could possibly be. I don't think there ever is a perfect circle. I may be talking out of turn, but I don't think there is that much of, but we were as close to the perfect circle as you get. Then, and Joe Thompson was a firm believer in there was a limit to how thick a shell should be. I know today they like to make it 10 plies. Does it really vibrate?
Gotta wonder about that, huh?
Yeah, we did wonder about it. So, in addition to the 5-ply shell, we put a 5-ply liner, top and bottom. So at the top and bottom of each shell, here and here, we actually had 10-ply, but the body of the shell was 5-ply. And we never felt that it should be any heavier. Not saying we're the only people that were right. But Joe said, the shell has to vibrate. Because the biggest part of your sound doesn't come so much from the shell as the way the edges are made.
The bearing edges? Mm-hmm. So what's your stance on the bearing edges there? I've seen a lot of different shapes.
Well, what we did, of course we had tools for that too. You take the side of the shell, the side of the shell coming up here, and we had a tool that took it a little bit off there and more like that. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
This is the shell. So we had a slight angle there and more here. 1/16 of an inch bearing edge.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look around, you'll see drums with a bearing edge like this. Now,
Or slightly rounded.
yeah, slightly rounded, yeah.
There's different
like
shapes
this.
for different drums.
And what is the purpose of this? Because the least amount of material that touches the head, the better response you're going to get out of the head.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to say that that wasn't original with us, because all you have to do is to look at a bass viol, a stand-up bass, where the bridge has been fitted by an expert, and you'll find that looking at the bridge sideways, that they have the same thing.
Where the strings lie on top.
Where the strings
almost
lie,
nothing.
get it as thin as you can possibly get it without cutting the string. Same thing on a violin. All that's fitted. Take a look at a guitar and notice that the bridge, the surface of the bridge where the strings go over, on a good guitar there's hardly anything touching the strings.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously. Because all you have to do to prove you set that thing yourself is to lay your finger on a batter head. All you got to do is lay your finger on the batter head, and what does it do? It muffles it, doesn't it?
Right.
Just that much. At this part of the drum, just lay your finger on there, and lay your finger, and it'll stop the vibrations. So obviously the same thing works when you lay the head on the drum. Plus, and it go back to Levy years ago, made what they called a floating head principle.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did was they made the head a little bit larger. So when you put the head on the drum, you could almost put something in between the flesh hoop and the shell.
Right.
What Rogers did, we took a 14-inch shell, which is actually 13 7/8.
To make the floating head.
Make the floating head so you wouldn't have to get special heads. See, Lee, by making their heads bigger, only their heads really fit on the drum the way they wanted it to.
I see.
It wasn't wrong in those days because all they had to do was get a different hoop because it was all skin heads. But with Remo and all these guys started making 14-inch heads. They were 14-inch heads. You could put them on a 14-inch drum with pearl and you forced it on.
Right.
And that head to stop the shell from vibrating.
So there goes your floating action after all.
That's right.
Right.
So the floating, all of the Rogers wooden shells were 1/8 of an inch less than what's specified. So a 14-inch shell was 13 7/8.
Mm-hmm.
And a 16-inch shell was 15 7/8.
So was this for wood and
Sure.
steel both?
Right.
Brass?
Same head. So, Premier made a lot of inroads into this country at one time. Just about the time we were getting into the professional end of the drum business, which was in the late 50s. Premier was a name to be reckoned with in this country, but they made one mistake. Their head sizes were different.
Oh.
And when the guy broke a head, he had difficulty finding a replacement. And I could never understand why they weren't aware of that.
Did they eventually straighten that out, I imagine?
Yeah, eventually. But they lost the foothold.
Uh-huh.
Because there was a well-respected drum line. And they made some nice stuff. But see, as sharp as you are, you can't always foresee what the future brings. We know that. And we were never too proud to admit that something wasn't great. We put out, like I say, this didn't turn out to be too great. The cymbal over it coming out at these angles. So that's why.
But at first you were just,
Yeah, sure.
feeling your way around there.
Right. All this. And again, I was a novice as well as anybody else. I got together with Cozy. These guys that don't realize that the more drums you can give them, the happier they were. This wasn't a good setup. Look at it.
That's kind of odd, but
Yeah.
the cocktail drum on the left there?
Yeah. Well, no, that's a
More
stick
time.
holder.
I mean, this...
Oh, yeah, sure. Right. But Cozy, bless his heart, whatever you wanted to give him was fine. The more drums, the better,
Uh-huh.
And I remember sending Tigers saying, the drums in a bad position. I said, well, Cozy, he's comfortable there, so this is his
Is
option.
this the mounted top right on top of
Yeah,
the...
right in the middle. So I said, well, Sonny, Brandon, the way you play and Bud and all these guys, sometimes, even this, this is only this catalog. This is, but that's all you see today. And as far as Buddy and Louis is concerned, this is the worst thing in the world. Roy Burke would play on something like this, he couldn't do it better. Because actually, Taylor used to play, you know, and the ride cymbal here.
Right.
Buddy, here we are. I tell you, I learned a lot from him.
I bet you did.
And he says, when I'm playing band and I reach out, I want that cymbal right there. And when I first set him up, I had to look for a real short L-shaped cymbal arm. Because he said, he wouldn't play his ride cymbal this high.
Mm-hmm.
We did it for picture purposes, see. But he wouldn't play it that high. And whereas I got him on the catalog, excuse me. That's even a little high for him, see. Because this was a telescopic cymbal holder. And he says, I can't play up here. And if you ever watched him play, if you ever have I'll call it a privilege of watching him, just unbelievable. And he knew naturally, most drummers know where their equipment is, but he'd be playing along and right there was the ride cymbal. Not up here. Why should I have to go up here? He used to say, and he's right.
I kind of wonder that about some of the really heavy rock drummers.
Yeah, they play this way.
Everything all over the place.
That's right. And I said, well, how about these cymbals? He says, and if you watch him play, you know how he played on these. He came up on these an awful lot.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, he says, when I'm reaching for my side cymbals, he said, I'm coming up like this, so it's okay to have it up there. Mm-hmm. But when I'm playing here, and I want to play the ride cymbal, I want it right here.
Right.
It was interesting. I once asked him, why do you need two floor tom-toms? You know what he used the second floor tom-tom for?
To set his coke on? I don't know how.
Never played it.
Is that right?
It looked good, but he used to have a towel on there. It was interesting. But what a guy. And I'll tell you, when I first got together with Buddy, I set him up in Philadelphia. At a bar. There was the quintet then. That was right after the Dorsey deal, you know. And I lost my jacket. And he'd say, I want everything so I can just reach it. I don't have to want to stretch for anything. So when we set him up, the tom-tom was a little bit over to the left. I said, okay. And he said, your cymbal's a little too high for me. So we went back to, there was a music store in Philadelphia called Music City. And they were predominantly a drum shop, but they handled other instruments. And Ellis Cole was one of the owners, good partners. We went through his pile and we found a little 6-inch cymbal. And that's what Buddy had on his drum.
Was this also Rogers?
Yeah. You know, just a plain cymbal arm was anybody's, you know. And then, do you remember this hi-hat? That's the old 502.
You know, it's funny, I found something that looks just like that, as a matter of fact.
I'll show you.
Let me get a picture
Yeah, I'll
of
show
that.
you a full picture of it.
Okay.
That's all right, go ahead.
You go right ahead. And that looks like it's just a bunch of, like you just pressed some steel into the right shape. A band of steel, like.
Put out by Walberg.
Walberg?
Walberg and Auge.
Auge.
That was, here. Here it is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I see you did deal in Camco.
Yeah, we used the Camco pedal also, you know. At that point, we weren't making a lot of the stuff. We were buying it for Walberg and Auge. We call them Auge. The name was actually Auge, A-U-G-E.
Right.
That everybody called it.
Were you going to say something about this pedal, for instance?
Yeah. So, as you see, that was the first pedal that we had with Buddy's outfit. And when I set Buddy up in this place in Philadelphia, and he's playing it, and his hi-hat's sliding all over the place.
Oh.
Which you know happens.
That'll drive you nuts.
Right. So he's sitting up on a elevated bandstand then, back of the bar, and he points to the hi-hat. He says, "Look, can't you do something about this?" So I looked at it and I said, "I'll see." So again, we remounted some of the stuff on the bass drum. We gave a whole new bass drum. Ellis told I said, "Ellis, Walberg puts out some spurs. And they might be in here too while we're talking." Yeah. Right. I had spurs. But what they did, Ludwig had for years, Ludwig had the spur on his hi-hat, but he had it on the heel. I keep forgetting what he's doing. There. There's a spur back here. It's the same 502 hi-hat in chrome, 502 HC. Anyway, and that's all well and good, but what moves the hi-hat is when you're doing this.
Yeah, it seemed like that wouldn't
Right.
the wrong place for the spur, huh?
So I said, "Ellis, I got an idea. Give me a couple of these spurs." And we took a hi-hat and we drilled a hole here and a hole there. Yeah.
And put it right there.
And where did I get that idea? From our foot pedal. I don't know if you're familiar with the Rogers foot pedal. But again, after one of my trips, I came back to Joe and I said, "Joe, there's one big problem all the drummers are having." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Bass drums forever creeping on these guys." So he said, "Well, you know what makes the bass drum move?" And I said, "What, Joe?" He said, "Well, when you accent the bass drum, the front end lifts up. So all these drum anchors that they sold for years, you know what I'm talking about?"
For the front of the drum?
Yeah.
Yes. Wrong place.
It didn't do anything. The minute the drum lifted up, they screwed it.
Right.
Joe Morello used to carry 2x4 with him. When he'd do a clinic, he'd nail it into the floor in front of the bass drum. Well, some clubs you go into, they won't let you do that and everything. Anyway, so Joe said, "I've been thinking of working on a pedal anyway." He said, "Why don't we see if we can incorporate something in the pedal?" So we put a pair of adjustable spurs at the point of pressure. So the harder you played on the bass drum, the more the spurs dug into the floor. Simple, isn't it?
Simple, and it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So the old story, why didn't I think of that? Huh? You know. So,
A question for you.
right.
I noticed the pedals, in essence, pretty much look the same, but the foot plates.
Yeah,
are
well, this
different.
is what we call a hinge pedal.
Oh, I see. There's no.
And this is like a one-piece footboard.
Right.
However, instead of being one piece, we made it adjustable. Why should a fellow who wears a size 12 shoe have to suffer with the same kind of a footboard as the guy who wears a size 7 shoe?
Right.
It makes sense, doesn't it?
Perfect sense.
Okay, so it's adjustable with a toe stop on it for the guys that play like this, you know. And by building the pedal in this design, we overcame the problem of where do you put the beater ball if you're playing on an 18-inch bass drum, which was very popular at about this time. That's against a 24-inch bass drum. If you're going to have a pedal like this, all you can do is raise or lower the beater ball. And in so doing, you are getting away from the fulcrum point, the perfect balance point. So we just fix it so you can raise the whole thing.
Oh, now that's another idea that sounds like a real good idea too, and I sure understand that. Otherwise, you might have just a real short beater.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the longer the beater, the harder it is to regulate it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you know yourself, if you're going to throw a whip, if you get a short whip or a long whip, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So this was adjustable primarily to take care of different size bass drums. Again, Buddy and Louie always wanted 24-inch bass drums, so did a few other guys. But the Max Roach style, you know, they went all the way down to 18-inch bass drums.
Right.
Well, we wanted to keep them all happy if we could. You know. So then, what happens when the guys are playing twin bass drums, double bass drums? The only thing they could do is angle their bass drums, right? In order to be able to play them. So, what do we do here? We fixed the pedal so it angles.
So you could actually angle the foot plate.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Now that guy right there looks like he's got his, is that Louis Belson? Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks like he's got his bases almost pointed straight out instead
That's
of
right.
angled.
Well, we purposely did that.
I see.
Now, then, in addition to that, I watch the drummers when they sit down. No drummer sits like this, do they? So the hi-hat's over here. Now, is it comfortable for this foot to be like this, or is it a little bit better this way? What is the most stand up? How do we usually stand up? We don't stand up like this.
Yeah, everybody's feet are a little bit apart at the toes.
Now, in order to feel at ease or comfortable, wouldn't it better if you could have a pedal designed that way? So when you're sitting, instead of having to turn, because if you turn the bass drum to compensate for that, then you're pushing the tom-tom away a little bit, aren't we?
Right.
It was all done with the idea of thinking of the drummer's comfort, which there was never an approach to that before. Here's the drum equipment. I hope you can rig it up so you're halfway comfortable when you're playing it. All that thought went into that. And I found that out by talking to all these different drummers around the country. What would you like to have your drum outfit set up? How would you like it set up so you'd be most comfortable? So that, now, again, so if you're a lefty or a righty, it doesn't make any difference. You can adjust all this to suit yourself. Plus the spurs. The only thing the spurs did not work on is the terrazzo floor. But they could work on any other floor and set it. I remember a guy in Cleveland was playing in a strip joint. And he was playing right on the dance floor. And he said, the drums are moving all over. He said, they won't let me put anything in front of the drum. I got something for you. I said, no, well, they know the spurs are in here, because they made a very fine point. That guy used that pedal for years, and for no other reason, only because it kept the bass drum from moving.
Yeah, I guess it didn't scratch their floor up.
No. But the action was tremendous. Now, in addition to the adjustments that I showed you, we could, by moving this up and down, not only took care of the beater ball, but it also changed the angle of the footboard. We had it on either one. Now, what is the most comfortable position for your foot?
Pretty much straight out whichever way.
Well, all right, this way. All right, now just take your foot and come back slowly and tell me when your calf starts to tighten up.
Well, yeah, that's a certain point.
Yeah. Now, what would happen if you had a foot? Keep it up. If you had a footboard that was shaped like this.
Oh, way up like that?
Well, I'm exaggerating.
Yeah, would be very uncomfortable.
Yeah. So I said to the guy, now, what you do is take this pedal, put your foot beside it, and tell me where you start to become uncomfortable. And they'd say, right here. I said, okay. So I would adjust the footboard to fit that angle. And I never had to go past that.
Mm-hmm. I'm really surprised at the amount of adjustment that was put into this pedal here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, tremendous.
Not only that, but I'm also amazed at how many of today's pedals and today's things are, if not exact copies,
They're copies.
very similar.
Oh, absolutely. We know
It's
that.
definitely based on
People used to
your
say,
ideas.
why didn't you cover it? I said, you can cover it till you're blue in the face. They can always skirt a patent. We know that. This was revolutionary. So, you see this price? Now, we're talking
$39.50.
We're talking 1962.
Mm-hmm.
Ludwig's speed pedal, which let's face it, they sold the Speed King.
Mm-hmm.
They sold thousands of them. $22.50. And I'm going to tell you something. I showed the prototype of this to Remo. Remo and I got to be rather close. Remo was a big help to me when I first got into the business. We handled a lot of Remo heads, even from the Grossen end, before we got into Rogers very deeply. And when I started to go out on the road, Remo was a big help to me. There would be some of the ropes and so on and so forth. We showed him that pedal at one of the conventions. And he said, what are you going to sell it for? And I said, well, we figure around $40. Oh, no, he said. I said, I'll never sell it. I said, but look what it's got. He says, you don't need that. I said, you don't like the spurs? Well, yeah, the spurs are good, but you don't need any of this other stuff. Now, I'm not putting Remo down, don't get me wrong, because he was from the old school, too, as far as drums are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, in my meanderings, I seem to feel that there's a place for all this. We don't expect to sell a lot of them. But the guys who really want real fine adjustment, we'll sell that pedal. You know we couldn't keep up with it.
Is that right?
Against Ludwig's $22.50 price. There was nothing in between.
Mm-hmm.
This was the one we tried to sort of compete with Ludwig. This one here.
The Rocket.
Yeah, that was our competition. But you notice again, now we used bearings on everything. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And why did we? Because I had fellas tell me, you know, when I played real fast, I had a feeling that the pedal was maybe freezing up on me. I would take it to guys who were real loud drummers. I would try to cover the field to see. And so I went back to Joe and I said, we got to do something about making sure that this thing doesn't freeze up on us. So we had roller bearings in all these things. See, inside there?
As opposed to like ball bearings?
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, we call them needle bearings.
Yeah. Plus, you know something else that I really liked about these pedals is the fact that you can adjust where you want your action set.
Exactly.
You want your beater back far or up near the head.
Yeah.
You want your spring action
That's what we did.
Just an awful lot of adjustment and a real nice job.
So, Al Wolf, there were two brothers who ran a drum shop in New York that they inherited from their father, Wolf's Drum Shop. I don't know if you ever heard the name. again, we're going back to the 60s on 48th Street. And when I showed him this pedal, he said, works good, you know, put it on a bed. He said, you don't need all these goddamn adjustments. Every time you sit down, you got to adjust the goddamn pedal like that. I said, Al, what kind of car do you drive? I always used to like to use automobiles as comparison, because everybody drives an automobile. Mm-hmm. He said, I have a Knowles. I said, what model? He says, 98. I said, see, that's interesting, because I have one too. I said, you have a 6-way power seat on it, don't you? He says, yeah. I said, doesn't that bug you? He says, why? I said, you go through that, all those adjustments every time you get in the car? He said, no, I said it, I'll leave it that way. I said, right. That's what you do with it. Mm-hmm. He said, yeah, I guess so, like that. But Al, I must point out, was a staunch Swivomatic dealer, which was fine. I mean, after all, he was out to push his product. And he was a Swivomatic dealer on 48th Street. We had Henry Adler on 46th Street as our dealer. And then after a while, Manny took it on also. We gave it to him. But they used to try every which way, you know, to go against it. And I don't know if you ever heard the story. Well, no, I'm going to tell you this because I don't want to publicize.
Well, we can
turn it off.
You were saying about Buddy?
Buddy would not permit me to put a tone control on the drum.
Is that right?
And I'd say, well, let's just take it off. He said, no. He said, take it out. And I said, you want to try it? He would not even lay a stick on the drum until I took it out. This is in the beginning. I wasn't aware. So I said, well, if I release it, what's the difference? So he'd say, it obstructs the sound inside of the drum. And I said, really? And he said, I'll tell you what you do. He says, hold the drum up, like this. And he said, I'll do this. And you keep turning the drum around, and I'll let you know when I hit this spot, without the tone control on. And he did. He said, it's slight, but I hear the difference. And he wouldn't put any muffling on any of the drums. Neither would Louis, neither would Roy Burns.
Even the bass drum?
Just strip muffling on the bass drum.
Uh-huh. How about the toms? Even strip muffling, no muffling at all?
Nothing at all.
Just like that, ring out.
And Red Floyd, who used to play with the Ringling Brothers Circus, played a 12 by 15 drum in back of a drum outfit. I called it a parade drum. He says, it's not a parade drum, Ben, it's a snare drum.
Did he use it as a snare drum? Or?
Yeah.
Because a lot of guys will take them and use them as toms.
And use 3S sticks. And I watched him do a show one time, and they had one of these trapeze artists doing flips. Played 105 flips, and he rolled and accented every one of them. He needed, that's why they use the 12 by 15 drums. Fantastic. Got 3S sticks.
This is a real classic you got there. What year is that, by the way?
Oh, I don't know. This is probably in 63, maybe 60.
Just one right off
the newer lugs on it.
One right off the rack, or
no?
Anything custom built for you? Or?
No. You want to know where I got this? I didn't have anything when I left. I really washed my hands. I was retiring, and I'll be honest with you. If I had been able to foresee, I thought I was through with the drum business and everything. As far as the business is concerned, I am. So I gave away all the photographs I had, all the literature, catalogs, and then after I got out of there and got talking to people, I decided I wish I had it. Harry got me this drum. Harry Canedy. Not only did he get it, he gave it to me. I came in, and I don't know if he wants that to get around, but I'll tell you this. I answered the door one day, and UPS hands me a cart. I opened it up, and this drum was in there. And I called Harry, and I said, "What this for?" He said, "Well, you had so much to do with it, I felt that you ought to have fun." And he sent it to me. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but look at the finish on this thing. Can you see the finish on the inside of that shell?
Yeah, looks great.
Now this shell had 3 coats of shellac, sanded and smoothed off after each coat. 3 coats, and then after it was all sanded down and smoothed out, then a stain was put on it. Look at that shell. Now look at the bearing edge. Can you see it? Right there.
Yeah.
See that bearing edge?
Yep, and I can see the 5-ply and the 5 more
That's
ply
right.
you're talking about.
And you can see where they're staggered. Here's one. See it?
Mm-hmm.
And you see the floating deal from the top, see in the top there? See how it floats a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Away from the shell.
Yeah, there's little space.
Yeah.
Right?
See why it's got Drum Center of Indianapolis, and that's Harry's.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a Weather King head on it. I don't mean Weather King. It had not awful, not Ambassador, Emperor head on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, it's the wrong head. So I called Lloyd McCausland at Remo, had him send me a Diplomat head. This is I don't know if you know the difference in the thicknesses. The Ambassador head was, you find on most drums, is 10 milligrams. This is 7.5. And the Emperor is 15. That's for parade drums. And Remo made a thinner one of 5 milligrams.
Mm-hmm.
Millimeters, not milligrams. I'm thinking of medicine. That Buddy used, but it's awful thin. Too thin for most people.
He liked the thin heads.
Yeah, Buddy Buddy even used the Diplomat head on his tom-toms.
Did he go through a lot of heads breaking them, or? I didn't think so, because it seems like even if he plays loud, he's still in control of it or something, you know?
Volume does not break the heads. You know what breaks the head? If you come in at it in that angle. But if I can take a stick and hit it as hard as I can possibly strike it. It won't break the head. But if I come in on it at an angle like this, that's why when you see fellas sitting in there, they got their tom-toms set like this. There's no way you can play it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Buddy used to have this 9x13 tom-tom, and it would just line up with the snare drum.
Right.
They would come down like this, and they could play it. I don't see how they're playing. That's like you said, how do they play those cymbals up here?
Right. Mm-hmm.
But see what I'm talking about? That's what they call response.
Yeah.
I hear the sound. It doesn't kill the drum sound. It embellishes it. Hear that overtone? Even here. And you know that's a dead spot. Now, we talked about the strainer. I want to show you this strainer. See that D? That letter? That means it's for the Dynasonic drums. You couldn't use the same one on the power tone. Because the power tone had a more pull on the string. There. Now see that roller mechanism in there?
Mm-hmm.
Now see right in this corner is a little notch.
Yeah.
Now on the power tone it doesn't have quite as much of a notch. Otherwise it would make it too hard to take off. But you see how simple that thing is? Anything good is simple, if you know what I mean.
Right. Well, I've just seen a stack of these lately, I'll tell you. Not wood, but metal snares. Just
And
stacked up.
I'll tell you, I'll go into detail. The metal snare was, and our hoops were built in collapsible chucks.
Collapsible chunks.
You just put a sheet of metal in there and lock the chuck up, and then they form everything. You ever see a spinner work? Metal spinner? They use a tool that looks like a rifle, and it's got a blade on the end of it. and they stand on the chuck, and they form, all of this is formed. A lot of hoops on the market are pressed out. These are formed. This is steel, these hoops. They're not cast. As a result, they have a sound to them. Hear it?
Yeah.
Cast doesn't have that sound. So when they make, all this was done in this chuck, and all these little forms here, all that was formed into the making of it.
So, this was not like a pressed out thing?
No, no, this is not pressed out.
Some guy went around and formed each one of those ears and...
Well, not the whole punch, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But all this is formed with a tool, and the flames, everything. He'd stand there and angle, and just hold that angle while Chuck went around.
Like a big lathe kind of thing or something?
Well, on that order.
Mm-hmm.
But and then when they got all through with the drum, in order to get the drum out, it was a collapsible chuck. That's how they described it. After it was done, they'd separate the machinery and pull the shell out. Gretsch just took a piece of metal and soldered it, and the drums were never level or anything. See, it was just a plain shell. It had no angles in it or anything.
And was your the metal Dynasonic or whatever all one piece?
Yeah. Well,
because I understood like another
it was,
company would take two pieces and put it together.
No, this is one sheet, and it would be brazed.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really soldered; it was brazed, and then everything was built around that. You had difficulty finding where it was joined, because it had to start out with a sheet. But everything else, and like I showed you in here, the trenches were put in with a tool. That went around, and then they used a smaller tool to draw the lines. This was decorative. When we talk about these lines, that's the wrong drum. This was after Buddy Rich left. But where was it here? Yeah. I'll get the Dynasonic. It is, that part was decorative.
Right.
But all these had a purpose.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Now when we used to, after we get the drum, and I don't have the stand here, so it's a little difficult.
You know,
See, I would do this.
I have the stand down the car. I didn't know.
That's all right. And we would stand there and keep working it. Some fellow said to me, "How do you know when to stop?" When you hear, you got to do it by. You have to do it by ear. When you get the sound you want, you'll stop. And here it is. And this will move. I could even back it off a little bit.
So if that wouldn't move, you'd say it'd be too tight.
If it wouldn't move, then I know it's choking. Where the average conventional snare, you pull it up into the head, don't you? Because years ago, when they used rope and gut, I'm going way back, rope. When you used gut, you had to pull it into the head. Otherwise, you got nothing out of it. And as a result, it had to choke. My feeling is that when you're listening to a marching band on the field, the snare drums don't sound like snare guns. Think about it. To me, they sound like drums with rope stretched across the bottom. But the drum corps, from what I've been told, weren't too interested in this kind of sound. They wanted it.
They wanted it loud and to really...
Loud and dead, almost.
Mhm.
That's the wrong word, but I think you know what I mean.
Right.
They were interested in the rhythmic pattern more than the sound. And I did some tests with a drum corps instructor in Philadelphia one time. I took 3 prairie drums, 12 by 15s. One of them I didn't put any muffling on. One I put muffling here, and one I put muffling right down through the center. You know what I'm talking about, the drum corps. And we went into a hall. Hall was probably as big as the width of this, length of this apartment. And I had Ellis Solon up on the stage with the 3 drums, and I said to the fellow, now I want you to go to the other end of the hall with me and tell me which drum sounds you like. And I said, go ahead, play them, Ellis. So he played. Finally, he said, now I'll do it again, and I won't use the same rotation. And he picked a certain drum. I said, you like that sound? He said, yeah, that's great. So while I'm talking to him, we were walking towards the stage. And as we get closer to the stage, I said, you still like that sound? He said, a little ringy, isn't it? And I said, yeah. If you want to call it a ring, I call it an overtone. But the one I had muffled down to the center, he didn't like at all. But that's what they used in the drum corps.
Mhm.
I said, so why do you do that? He said, well, when the inspectors judge, when the judge is listening, he's standing right near the drums, and we don't want him to hear that sound. So they were playing for the judges more than anybody else. I said, but you realize up in the stand you can't really hear those, they don't sound like drums? He says, I know. But that's a test we made. And I found that to be very prevalent with the drum corps. I'm not putting it down. And you ever see the keys they use? They have a drum key with a big rod on it, the drum corps. And I said, I don't think they go to such extremes today. I said, why are you doing this? He said, well, we got to up the pitch up. I said, well, why don't you use 10 by 14 drums if you want a higher pitch? Oh, he says, they wouldn't look good against the 12 by 15 tenors. I said, they wouldn't look good? They said, no, we like all the same size when they're marching down.
Mhm.
So the sound was secondary. You get that?
Right.
And they used to really crank those things up like you couldn't believe. And of course, when Remo first came out with his plastic heads, he had a problem that were pulling out of the hoops.
Really tighten them down. Yeah.
And they'd pop out.
Uh-huh.
He found a way to eliminate that, but until he did,
Mhm.
Ludwig came out with a hoop that was shaped like this, and the head fit in here. And then they would bend this over.
Mhm.
Remo didn't do that. Remo made a hoop like this, and he used an epoxy in there. And until he got one that pulled, he had problems. But Ludwig, and the argument was that when Ludwig did that, they killed this part of the sound of the head, because they put pressure on the heads.
Right.
So again, which was more important? Ludwig sold a lot of heads. He bought them from Remo at first. Then he went in, Ludwig Sr. went to Europe. Now I'm telling you a lot of stories that went on. And he copied some guy in Germany. He saw the guy making those heads in Germany, so he came back here and made Ludwig heads the same way. Swivomatic came out with heads and copied Ludwig. Ludwig sued him, took him to court. Did you ever hear that?
I think there was something about that in the vintage drum video.
You know who ended up the head? The attorneys.
Mhm.
They finally, Bud Swivomatic proved that Bill Sr. went over to Germany and copied the man over there.
Oh.
So he had no right to sue Bud
I thought it
Swivomatic.
was something like that. That patent could be applicable to
No.
things like other.
Well, it wasn't original.
Like sewing hoops or
It
whatever.
wasn't Bill
Yeah.
Ludwig Sr.'s original idea.
Uh-huh.
he passed it off as such.
Uh-huh.
And some of the guys that work for Lugs, you know, that unfortunately, when the guys get too old, people, I shouldn't say they lose respect, but they lose a little patience with them.
Right.
So the old man Ludwig, and he did a lot for the drum business.
No doubt.
He was a competitor, but he did, I got to say, much more than Bill Jr. did. But Bill Jr. and I used to tug of war. Actually, we were heavy competitors.
I was kind of curious about that too.
And no one ever matched Ludwig's volume. But I've got to be honest with you. And I told Bill one time at a meeting, I said, you know, Bill, I got to tell you something. I respect the amount of business that you do. You sell more drums than anybody. He says, we do, huh? Right. I'm glad you realize that. I said, but unfortunately, you don't make the best drum. We used to fence with each other that way. And for some reason or other, I used to rise to certain heights when I was with Bill. And I'd say, no, you don't make the best. You make the most, but you don't make the best. You make the best. But now that it's all in the past, we love each other. I said, we're not competitors anymore, Bill. But it was a tug of war.
Well, from what I hear too, it sounds sort of like what George Way would be up against at times.
George Way, poor guy. He just things never really worked out for him the way they should have. George was a big factor in the drum business, and one time he worked for us. Oh, he did? Yeah. Most people aren't aware of that. It wasn't long. When George, I'm trying to think what it was. It had to be in the 60s. I think it was after he lost his drum company to Canedy.
Right.
You know what happened there. George never had the capital. And that's not a disgrace because you just don't open up a business on peanuts. George had a lot of experience. He worked for Levy, as you know, and then he opened up a distributorship on percussion merchandise. Then some way or other he got involved in the factory, which was fine. And he needed money, so he went to Campo. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. His name wasn't Campo. But he ran a machine shop. And
but that was the name of the machine shop, wasn't it?
Right. Joe, I'm trying to think of his name. Anyway, and he got him to invest, the way I hear it, invest some money into the drum company and used some of his equipment like we did. We bought it from him. And I guess it got to the point where John Michon, I think is his name, owned more than 50% of the company. And you know what happened? Where George got pushed up. And then he opened up a little distributorship after that. Then we hired him. Well, I don't know if he'd come to work for us. And we brought him in primarily with the idea of checking Dynasonics and things like that. We used to check these drums. We didn't just throw a drum together and put it in a cart. They were all checked, believe me.
Big quality control, huh?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And but George wasn't happy doing that. So he stayed with us, and he tried to get us to make some hoop mount holders. And I said, George, that's outmoded.